Welcome. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining Carson and Saint's latest training. We are going to talk about the joining of risk management and vulnerability management and your path to continuous security and compliance. I am going to be your moderator. I'm Connie Seal. I'm your moderator for today's training, and I'm going to bring a business perspective to our discussion. I will also introduce you to Carson and Saint's world-class QSA, Mrs. Jane Laroussi, and also our CTO, Sam Kline. He's our chief architect for the Saint Security Suite. By way of an introduction, I just want you to know that I absolutely love what I do for a living, and I strive not only to make our customers secure, but I bring it home. Now, my family and friends, they also have to follow good security practices. I am a PMP with a Master's Certificate in Program Management, and I am certified as a HIPAA professional, a cybersecurity architect, and a security compliance professional. My whole career has been in cybersecurity in one form or another. I've been in IT for 30 years, for 20 years, very much focused in compliance and security. I also have a unique skill that I can speak to the business. I understand business, how they think, how they talk, their operations. And then I have the flip side, which was working in the trenches with IT, leading incident response and recovery efforts, deploying websites in the middle of the night. I've been on either side of an audit, the pass and the fail consequences. And very frequently, I do our gap and risk assessments, and I actually love writing policies and procedures. So I love compliance and security. However, I don't believe just because you pass an audit or if you're compliant, that makes you secure. So hopefully we'll be able to teach you about that. In the meantime, I'd like to introduce Mrs. Jane Laroussi. She's our Senior IT Security Specialist, our Lead QSA and ASV. Jane?
Oh, thanks, Connie. So like Connie, I've been working in IT for a long time, over 35 years. I actually started out as a programmer and then also worked with some very large databases for several years. But the past 23 years have been focused on cybersecurity and information assurance. One of my first projects in that area was a vulnerability scan of a really large network, over 100,000 targets. And actually, the product that we used was a very early precursor to the Saint Security Suite. I've also done some incident response, developed training, and also developed policies and procedures like Connie, but most of my work has been performing assessments, several different types of assessments as part of the NIST risk management framework, FISMA assessments for several federal agencies for the Office of the Inspector General, and more recently, PCI DSS assessments.
Thanks, Jane. So now I'd like you to meet Mr. Sam Kline. He's our Chief Technology Officer and the Chief Architect for Saint Security Suite. Sam?
Thanks, Connie. Hi, I'm Sam Kline. I'm also a CISSP and a PCI approved scanning vendor. I'm a person that understands the translation between the software's gathering of and interpreting of information and trying to present it in a way that's both useful inside and outside of IT. Saint has over 20 years of different views of shaping the functionality and reporting. I've been an ASV for thousands of ASV scans per year.
All right, thanks, Sam. So I do want to mention that we are not actors, not used to being recorded, and we are definitely not in a studio. But what we are experienced, caring practitioners of cybersecurity, and together, we have over 100 years of experience. Jane and Sam and I, this is what we do every day. This is our real life. So we want to teach you some things today. We're going to show you how to boost the maturity of your risk management and vulnerability management programs. We're also going to show you how joining them together will help you achieve continuous security and compliance. And we also want to share some pitfalls with you. Then we're going to provide recommendations how to avoid those pitfalls. That way you can improve your security and compliance using the tools. And we're going to join our vulnerability management program to your business's risk management program, just to make that positive impact. So we want this to be interactive, and we invite your questions throughout the training. It's hard to make something like this interactive, but if we can pull your question in while we're talking, we will. And if not, we have time at the end that we've reserved to answer your questions. Okay, I'm going to start on the business perspective, and I'm going to speak a little bit about compliance. Compliance requires risk management and vulnerability management programs. And both of these make you secure. However, there's a very important element that lets you boost your security and reduce your risks. And that's when you join the two programs together and apply the magic of maturity. Maturity in your approach to cybersecurity means you're going to build, maintain, and execute continuous processes that improve your organization's security posture. Maturity is invaluable and very hard to attain. So, for example, if you do the same thing for 10 years and it works for 10 years so far, you may not be more mature or more secure. You might just be lucky. So remaining status quo is dangerous. We want cybersecurity to mature. We want it to evolve just like a river across a landscape carves a new landscape over time. Your attentions, your reactions to changes in the threats and the dangers posed by malicious attackers also needs to evolve and mature over time. Now that's where we want to be, but unfortunately we're not there yet. We're going to talk about our number one pitfalls from 3 different points of view: from the business point of view, from an assessor's point of view, and from the technologist's point of view. So from a business point of view, I think the biggest pitfall is getting the message up to the executive level of your organization and having that interaction with your executive team. A lot of times, IT, when trying to speak to an executive team or a board of directors, they speak in a language that the executive level doesn't understand. If we send them a quarterly vulnerability scan, that's really not going to help them make decisions. That'll help the IT group make decisions, but it's not really going to help the board of directors. What we need is them to understand security at the highest levels of the organization and set that tone at the top. A lot of times in real life, the board member or the executive really only wants to know, am I more secure? Are we secure? And unfortunately, if we just say yes, we're not really taking advantage of our executives being able to do the things that only they can do. So we need to remove all that IT terminology. We don't want to walk in the door with, oh my God, did you hear about the $5 million settlement with CHS from their data breach? That's probably the latest, biggest one. But they do need to know there'll be a breach. There's a potential for a breach, and it may just happen. And what they need is that assurance that we'll be ready when it does occur. So what do we recommend? Well, if you have a good partnership with your CEO or CFO, where you can have that conversation and they can translate it into that executive level, or if you employ a trusted partner, an external trusted partner in cybersecurity, a lot of times they could walk into the boardroom and be heard where someone in IT isn't heard. If you can develop a 3-year plan, which is going to improve your security posture based on the actual threats to your organization that's uncovered by the facts found in your vulnerability management program, and then explain, demonstrate how the investments in security have and will continue to improve the security of your organization so that executives see that return on investment, That will help, especially if you can get cybersecurity into the budget. Oftentimes it's buried in the IT budget. If we can move that up to the organizational budget at that profit and loss statement level, instead of buried inside that IT budget, there'll be more visibility at that executive level. And then what you need to do is be back in the boardroom or be back in that executive level meeting and explaining and showing how your 3-year plan is coming to fruition and evolving and changing as all these threats change. That's my #1 pitfall. Sam, as a technologist, can you share your #1 pitfall, please?
Sure, Connie. As a technologist, I think the #1 pitfall is people focusing too much on passing their assessment and not enough on security. I've actually seen cases in the past where customers have tried to defeat the scanner in order to get a passing attestation. And I've seen cases where ASV customers will give a whole lot of extraneous evidence trying to convince the ASV that they're secure rather than just fixing the vulnerability. So really, customers would be better off investing their effort in fixing the vulnerabilities and upgrading the obsolete equipment rather than trying to convince the ASV to make an exception. Another big pitfall is the one and done outlook. Sometimes we hear, well, I passed last quarter, so I should pass this quarter. But that I passed last quarter, that's not evidence of a false positive. The threat landscape is constantly changing, and so do the scan results. Scoping is another big pitfall that you run into sometimes. If you're an ASV scan customer, you're probably aware that scoping is the responsibility of the scan customer. And the scope should include everything that provides a path to the cardholder data environment. And that needs to include unique entryways into existing components, such as name-based virtual hosts. So if you're scanning a web server, which is using name-based virtual hosting, and you only scan it by IP address, you're not going to crawl through the website because you need to give it that host name in order to get it to find the correct application. So you need to provide both the IP address and the host name in your scope. Scan interference is another pitfall that we run into sometimes. That's defined as the ASV program guide by interference from an active protection mechanism. That is an intrusion prevention system or a web application firewall, which may dynamically block the scanner's IP address after it detects an attack. And that's considered an inconclusive scan for the ASV requirements. That's not to be confused with a static firewall. A static firewall is one which just applies static rules, which either block a certain type of traffic or permit a certain type of traffic, but doesn't dynamically change the behavior. So those types of firewalls don't constitute interference and are acceptable during ASV scans. You don't need to whitelist those. So over-reliance on CVSS base score is a pitfall. If you're not familiar with CVSS, that stands for Common Vulnerability Scoring System, which is a standard for measuring the impact of vulnerabilities. So usually when you're looking at a compliance report, what you're looking at is the CVSS base score, a number from 0 to 10 telling you the impact. However, the base score is just one of 3 parts of the CVSS. The other 2 parts are the environmental score, which measures the business value of assets, an asset being something like a web application, a database, or a point of sale device. And then the third component is the temporal score, and that factors in things that change over time, such as whether or not an exploit is available or whether or not a fix is available for the vulnerability. So you need all 3 scores, the base score, the environmental score, and the temporal score in order to get the complete impact of the vulnerability. And my final pitfall is a false sense of security. So just saying we have a firewall isn't a mitigating factor for every vulnerability. You have to know what your firewall is doing. And the firewall is only as good as its rules. So you have to look at the vulnerabilities on a case-by-case basis to decide, is my firewall really mitigating this vulnerability?
Well, what do you recommend for avoiding this pass and fail mentality, Sam?
Good question, Connie. First of all is open communication. A good relationship between the ASV or the assessor and the customer is the key. Both the ASV and the customer need to know their responsibilities, and they both need to have the best interests of the customer's security in mind.
All right. Now on to that third perspective, that of an assessor. Jane, can you share in your experience what is the #1 pitfall on the path to meeting continuous security and compliance?
Sure thing, Connie. So what Sam just described is an example of where you focus just on vulnerability management and compliance and you don't also understand and manage risk. And the goal of an assessment is to identify risk, not just from vulnerabilities, but from other threats such as environmental threats or human threats. And it's really important to identify risk so organizations can decide what to do about the risk. They can accept the risk, they can avoid the risk by eliminating the threat or vulnerability that caused it. They could mitigate it by installing a patch or putting in other compensating controls, or they could share or transfer the risk by, for example, purchasing cybersecurity insurance. But effective risk management is dependent on a thorough and complete assessment, and that is dependent on proper scope determination, and that's my #1 pitfall, that oftentimes assessments don't have the proper scope. So from an assessment perspective, scope is often defined by the customer, as Sam mentioned for ASV scans, for example. Sometimes the scope is driven by the underlying compliance framework. For example, if you're doing an assessment under the NIST risk management framework, the scope is usually the authorization boundary for the system, but often that boundary's been found to be incorrect. And I think all of us have experienced some kind of scope creep in our projects, not just security assessments. Sometimes it's been too broadly defined, but more often than not, it's too narrow. And that brings us back to risk again. You can't manage risk if the scope of your security assessment isn't accurate and if you haven't identified which assets are most critical. So for PCI assessments, for example, the customer defines the scope, but the QSA is required to validate the scope. And a lot of times I've found for organizations that are new to PCI, they often assume that the scope of their full PCI assessment is the same as their ASV scan. So for their ASV scan, they're scanning maybe their e-commerce website and they figure, okay, I'm finished now. But in reality, they have some other components that are part of their cardholder data environment that are internal facing. So they may actually have point of sale devices or databases or other assets that perform back office functions. And then often they forget about the people and processes too. It's not just the technology, it's the people and what do they do and how do they manage the data and what processes they follow.
People, process, and technology. We hear that a lot. So how do we avoid focusing on just vulnerability management and compliance without also understanding and managing risk? What do you recommend?
So there's a couple different things you need to be aware of and keep in mind. One of the things we often tell people when they're trying to figure out what the scope is to follow the data. Data flow diagrams are great. Just figuring out where is your data, where did it come from, where is it going, are you sharing it with anybody? Does it transform as part of the process? Maybe it starts out as not sensitive, but by the time your workflow is finished, it is sensitive. For PCI assessments, we usually say follow the money. A lot of times when you start a PCI engagement, they are really only aware of their e-commerce point of presence, or maybe we're only brick and mortar, we just have point of sale terminals. But then you talk to the business office and ask them, well, what merchant IDs do you have and which ones are collecting funds? And they tell you like 10 merchant IDs and you only know about 2 of them. And then it's also really important to identify, once you've got your scope determined, which assets are critical. Risk-based vulnerability management is really dependent on both not only how important the asset is, but the risk posed by vulnerabilities to that asset. And I'll talk about that a little bit more later. And then use your tools. So you have a vulnerability scanner, you need that to be compliant in most cases, but use it for not just identifying vulnerabilities. They're great tools for other things to help you identify and validate scope and to identify critical assets. So you can use your scanning tools to enumerate or just find hosts on the network. You can use your tools to list the software that you found running on those hosts. You can identify trust relationships with hosts that weren't included in the scan that you're running. So let's say you're trying to validate scope and you scanned 5 assets, and then the scan said, well, but these assets talk to these other hosts. Well, maybe they should be in the scope too. And then a lot of scanners have features that let you categorize or tag your assets based on criticality. So once you've got your scope identified, you can tag an asset as, you know, critical or medium or low. And then when you actually get your scan results, that will help you prioritize. So just because you have the same vulnerability across your organization doesn't mean you need to fix them all at once. You want to fix them on your critical assets first, and then worry about those lower criticality assets later. And then finally, many vulnerability tools, including the Saint Security Suite, include tools that let you search for sensitive information on your network. So if you're trying to find hidden credit card data or other sensitive information like social security numbers, you can use your tool to do that. And then if you find it, well, maybe that place where you found it needs to be in scope too.
Got it. Thank you. So we're going to give you your first boost. This boost is going to propel you on the path to continuous security and compliance. So we've had our pitfalls from the business, technology, and assessor perspectives. Well, how do we boost our path to continuous security and compliance? First, you want to join your risk and vulnerability management programs. If you can execute them in tandem continuously, it will boost your level of security and compliance because it's not a one and done thing. Your vulnerability management program yields many results. And if you take those results, feed them to your risk management program, let your risk management program consume the results, then you can make informed business decisions. You can eliminate or mitigate the most dangerous threats first. And by joining these two and layering on top of that a level of maturity, continuously use the outcomes of your vulnerability management program, feed that to your risk management program, and then let your risk management program prioritize and then reprioritize risk. All of this in a continuous process using the latest information from your vulnerability management tool. Then you can focus your attack on the right risks, the ones that have the highest threats to your organization. And finally, you can align and choose to mitigate the threats and risks that align most with your business goals. So we've talked about all our number 1 pitfalls and how to join risk and vulnerability management programs to attain continuous security and compliance. We will make us more secure, but Jane, I was wondering if you could talk about how we can apply this type of a boost to any pitfall. For example, I've been reading a lot about shadow IT, what it is, and how does it factor into your vulnerability and risk management programs?
That's a great question. And actually was at a briefing earlier today where this exact topic came up. It's the whole idea of your environment is always changing. So you need to be prepared from both a vulnerability management and a risk management perspective to adapt to your changing environment. And one way your environment changes is shadow IT. Another one would be maybe moving to the cloud. But since you asked about shadow IT, I'll talk about that first. So what does that mean? Simplest definition, it's IT that gets deployed outside of the usual process and often without explicit approval. A lot of times, developers might download a trial piece of software, they're trying to do a proof of concept, and then they decide to keep it in production and forget to go back to the security team or the assessors to have them really look at how they're using it. Often the entire approval process gets skipped because it takes too long and I need this product right away and they're not going to let me use it because they're always really strict. Sometimes you'll also find that certain types of procurements don't require IT to be involved if it's under a certain dollar threshold. And sometimes it's a pretty big dollar amount and you can buy a lot of pretty cool things and fall under that threshold. And so you just have to issue a purchase order and you can get your cool tool and IT doesn't know anything about it. And then cloud is another area where your environment's always changing. It's really easy to deploy cloud services. You can do it by getting like a demonstration version of something. You can do test runs in both Azure and AWS. Even if you have an established cloud presence, it's really easy within the cloud to deploy services without letting someone else know what you're doing or to do it incorrectly. And there's even other things that you need to be aware of as part of your changing environment. You know, mobile devices and Internet of Things is a term you'll hear a lot. Operational technology, you know, interconnected things that we don't really think about from an IT perspective all the time. And you could almost call it shadow IT, would be, you know, the sensors that are monitoring the heating and cooling in your building and running your sprinkler system. And, you know, in industrial environments, really important industrial environments, the systems that run those types of things, those are all sometimes shadow IT that you don't know about. And the concern and the challenge is it's unknown risk. If you don't know what you have, you can't protect yourself against problems with it. If it doesn't go through the proper risk assessment, how do you know if it's configured right? Is it using insecure protocols? Who has access to it? Does someone from the outside have access to it? The Target breach is that great example of, we got breached because the HVAC system's front end didn't use multi-factor authentication, and someone breached the target network and then managed to crawl their way across the network to where the important stuff was. And then if you have shadow IT, it doesn't get incorporated into your vulnerability and patch management program. Is it being scanned at all? Is it getting patched? And then, you know, with the cloud, a lot of on-premise components still have a cloud component that maybe you don't realize, or maybe you as the IT person realize, but the person who procured it doesn't realize it. They think they just downloaded this cool app, but they don't realize that all the data processing and storage is really happening in the cloud. And, you know, there's some challenges for identifying that type of IT in the cloud.
You know, I'd like to interject a real life example. I have a customer who does have departments with a certain signing authority level, and they very much all the time go out and get some piece of software, install it themselves or with a little bit of help from the vendor. No one else in the organization except for the people that use it know about it, and then it stops working. So who do they call? Well, the vendor's not there for them because there's no contract that included any kind of support, and IT gets called. The IT help desk, that's who's going to fix it all. So then IT doesn't know a thing about it, and they get so frustrated. I just have seen it so many times. Because IT did not know anything, they then had to ramp up, scramble, figure out how does it work, where is it actually installed, who uses it, who has access, what are the security implications. And now the business has adopted this as a critical part of their workflow. Well, for the business person, this is very, very detrimental. It disrupts not only IT and their goals on making you more secure in that 3-year plan, but the business can't do what they need to do. And then they're frustrated with IT. IT is frustrated with the business. It doesn't ever turn out good. So I just had to share that example. Can you tell us about your recommendations now?
Right. So my recommendation actually is from a business perspective, and it goes back to something both you and Sam mentioned earlier, that communication in general is key across the organization in order to successfully join your risk management and vulnerability management programs. That, you know, vulnerability and risk management apply no matter where the IT exists, not just on premise, but everywhere in the cloud, on those Internet of Things devices, on that crazy monitor that beeps all the time when it gets too hot in your office. And you need to follow your data. You need to figure out, well, what am I protecting in the first place? And that requires communications too. You can't just ask the IT people where the data is, because maybe they don't know. You need to ask the people that actually use it where the data is. So really, people, you know, people need to understand the process. They need to understand their responsibility, even if they have nothing to do with IT. They need to know, hey, if I'm going to buy something that sounds like a computer, I better ask somebody about it. And then everybody also needs to speak the same language. That's also really important. Everybody needs to agree on what the word vulnerability means, and they all need to agree on what risk means. Everybody has their own personal perspective of what those mean, but everybody needs to have the same understanding of what they mean in their organization. And then Connie mentioned this way at the beginning, the policies and procedures only work if everybody knows where they are and what they mean and, you know, what I'm supposed to do with them.
All right, thank you, Jane. Sam, do you have any recommendations from a technology or a tools perspective? Features of the vulnerability management tools? How do you make your vulnerability management and risk management more secure? And what does vulnerability management do when IT moves to the cloud? Can you speak to your recommendations?
Sure, Connie. So when you're scanning your cloud environment, you need a tool which is going to integrate with your cloud hosting provider, be it AWS, Azure, or one of the other providers. If you've used cloud, you know that the cloud, it introduces some unique challenges. One of them is a lack of a static public IP address. So in the cloud, your public IP addresses tend to be random, and then they get reassigned when you bring the instances down and up again. So if you're used to having a contiguous block of IP addresses in your on-premises environment, the cloud is nothing like that. So you're going to need a tool which is able to enumerate those instances and find where they are. Another thing about the cloud is virtual private networks or virtual private clouds, VPCs. So a lot of times you're going to have your cloud assets segregated into different VPCs that don't necessarily have visibility between each other. So you may need to deploy scanners within more than one VPC in order to get the full picture. And of course, scaling up and down is another unique challenge in the cloud, whereas your servers were pretty much constant when they were on premises. In the cloud, you bring servers up when you need to scale up, and then you terminate them when you need to scale back down. So you always have kind of a changing environment that you need to be scanning, which is why you need a tool which is capable of keeping up with that and tracking your instances. So another good thing for a tool to have is the ability to run discovery scans and or passive scanning in order to find shadow IT systems that show up on the network. And finally, you need a tool which allows you to do a software inventory of your network to see what's being installed. Usually this involves running a credentialed scan. That is a scan that's able to get into the registry of the endpoints in order to see what software is installed on them.
Can I ask you a question, Sam?
Sure.
You mentioned discovery scans or passive scans to find shadow IT. Can you explain that for someone who's not as familiar with those terms?
Sure. So what I mean by a discovery scan is a scan of your environment, but not a vulnerability scan, just looking for finding live targets and finding what operating system those live targets are running. And by passive scans, I mean a scan that doesn't actively send requests out over the network, but instead just monitors the network looking for activity, looking to see what IP addresses are sending or receiving traffic on your network. So each of those two things is good for discovering new assets.
Or shadow IT.
Right.
Well, it's time for our second boost, which is going to propel you on the path to continuous security and compliance. The thing that I'd like to recommend is that you formalize your risk and vulnerability management programs. Compliance requires policies and procedures. Defining your policies and procedures, they need to include that repeatable, continuous process. They also need to be in writing. You can't have an effective policy or procedure that is in your head, that's institutional knowledge of one or two people. Then you also need to apply your lessons learned through your risk and vulnerability management programs to improve the actual formal policies and procedures. So compliance requires policies and procedures, and compliance requires you to review your policies and procedures at least once a year. However, I'd like to recommend that a secure process, a mature process, would update those policies and procedures as the lessons are learned throughout the year. It's about people, again, just like Jane said, people need to know the policies exist. They need to use them. And the people that need to use them are those who are part of risk management and vulnerability management, all the relevant individuals. It could be an employee, a vendor, temporary work labor. So then the last point is that training. You want to train all the people who use the policies and procedures. You want to know what your policies and procedures say if you're that person. You want to know when they change. You are the best person to recommend changes to policies and procedures when they don't work. And if you don't know what your procedures say, or you can't execute them the way they're written, they're not mature, they're not really of value. So we really want to mature our policies and procedures. I call that formalizing them. Jane, back to you. We've talked about our pitfalls. We've provided recommendations of joining risk and vulnerability management programs, execute them, following formalized policies and procedures surrounding how to make those continuous, repeatable, mature processes, eliminating the one and done mentality. And we've given you 2 boosts on your path to continuous security and compliance. So, Jane, do you think we've achieved our goal of continuous security and compliance?
I'll use the QSA answer. It depends. And I like to also follow up to a question that came in the chat, and actually kind of leads into what I'm about to say, which is, you know, for policies and procedures that you need support from the top, that they can't just be IT or security and compliance issued. They have to be issued at the top and be the property of the entire enterprise. And I think one of the ways that you do that is to effectively present the fact that this does matter to the enterprise. And that goes back to what Connie said way at the beginning, is, you know, you need to make sure you can present this information to the upper management in a way that's meaningful to them. And I mean, it's sort of like a boost and a challenge is if you take risk and vulnerability management in isolation specific to a system or a project or a department, that doesn't help anyone at the top understand risk. They need to understand it across the entire organization. So you need to be able to present that to them in a way that's meaningful. You have multiple departments, they're in different geographic locations. They each have their own identified vulnerabilities and risks, and even risk tolerances. So if you look at it individually, you might have one department that maybe has really high visibility, but the impact of some risk is really low to them. And that's the one that you focus on. You go, well, you know, that vulnerability doesn't really matter because XYZ department who's really important says it doesn't. But then you have this other department who maybe isn't as visible, but that same risk to that department is really, really impactful. And if that vulnerability were to be exploited and that risk becomes present, that could have an impact not just to that department, but the entire organization. So how do you get that big picture that you can present to management? I'm going to go back to my use the tools you have. Vulnerability scanners are great tools for visualizing vulnerabilities and risk across an organization and over time. And you want to look for things like spikes in vulnerabilities. You want to look for maybe departments that have larger than average vulnerabilities or that don't improve over time or maybe are lagging. And that brings me to another kind of boost in a way is metrics. Metrics matter. You shouldn't just focus on that CVSS score and go, okay, let's hit all the criticals tomorrow. You need to understand your overall risk and what areas are critical and risk across your departments and locations. And you want time-based metrics, like how long does it take to remediate a vulnerability? How long are they present? How long does it take you to find them in the first place from when they're announced maybe by, you know, US CERT or the vendor? How long does it take you to detect them? How old are they? How many new ones are you detecting? How many are you remediating? And then really cool features are trends and benchmarks. You know, graphically visual, frankly, you know, executives like pictures, not numbers, you know, pie charts that can show you a big circle where most of it's green and then you have a little yellow piece and a little red piece, or benchmarks that can show over time. You know, we had 3,000 vulnerabilities last week, and now we're down to 2,000, or maybe there's a spike. But in order for that to work, you need to be able to use your tools effectively. You need to understand why there actually might be differences in your scan results across time and across your organization. And so, you need to understand that things that could cause your scan results to look different over time is shadow IT, or people not following the change management process, where they make a change to some configuration that suddenly introduces a vulnerability that you didn't have last week. And going back to what Sam said, well, I passed last month, I should pass this month. If your patch management and vulnerability management program isn't mature, it's not repeatable, per what Connie said, you might be missing patches occasionally. And the biggest contributor sometimes is lack of resources, people and dollars, and that inadequate long-term planning, like Connie mentioned, for things like end-of-life hardware, software applications. If you don't have that communications across the organization to understand that, 6 months from now or a year from now, this version of this operating system or this piece of software will no longer be supported, and a vulnerability that used to be not such a big deal now becomes a big deal because it's never going to get patched. The vendor's going to be like, you know what, we're not patching that anymore. You need to be able to use the tools that you have to help you with all that planning. So I'm going to ask Sam the question instead of Connie this time, is like, what are some of the reasons that you've seen with all of those scans that you've seen as an ASV and the manager of that program that would cause scan results to change over time?
Well, there are a number of reasons for that, Jane, and probably the biggest reason is when new vulnerabilities are discovered in existing software. So even if you haven't made any changes on your network, there could be new vulnerabilities in them. If you work in vulnerability management, you're probably aware that somewhere around 100 new vulnerabilities are announced every week, either by vendors or by security researchers. And that causes new vulnerabilities to come up in your scan results. Another reason why your results may change is when new software is installed on your network. This goes back to the shadow IT discussion that we were having before. When new systems come up on your network, then that ends up creating new results. A configuration change to an existing software is another reason why your scan results may change. Even if you haven't upgraded anything or haven't installed anything new and no new vulnerabilities are there, if somebody goes in and makes a small change to a configuration file, sometimes that's all it takes to expose a new vulnerability. Another reason is changing CVSS scores in the National Vulnerability Database. So when you're talking about compliance, usually the National Vulnerability Database, also known as the NVD, is the official source of the CVSS base scores, which are used in your reports, which may determine whether or not a vulnerability passes or fails. And once in a while, these scores change in the NVD, which causes a corresponding change in your report. So a vulnerability that was passing last quarter may cause failure this quarter, or vice versa, simply because its score changed in the NVD. Another possible reason is authentication failures. For credentialed scans, usually you're using an account which has a certain access level on the endpoint. Well, if that access is revoked, or if the credentials changed between the last scan and this scan, that could cause the credentialed scan not to be able to gain the same level of access and therefore not find the same issues. And finally, even if nothing else changes, there may simply be temporal factors which cause the scan results to change. For example, if your TLS or SSL certificate has expired since the last time you ran a scan, or if your operating system has reached its end of life since the last time you ran a scan, then that's going to cause basically an unfavorable result in your compliance report, where a vulnerability which may not have existed before now causes failure.
Very good. So change over time, trends over time, it's relevant as a business, as an assessor, and in technology. Wow. So what did we learn from the pitfalls that we've all discussed? Simply put, we can't manage vulnerabilities and risk if we don't know what we have. And if we don't know what we have, we can't protect it and plan for it in the future. That's our topic of joining of risk management and vulnerability management, your path to continuous security and compliance. I'd like to know if anybody has any questions.
So Connie, I see a question in the chat that asked, how do you measure the maturity of a security program? Is there a suggested framework?
Oh, that's an easy question. Thank you. Well, there's several maturity models on the market. Maturity is hard to attain, but there's a lot of models out there. What is a maturity model anyway? This is just a benchmark. We use it for comparison, and then we use it as an aid to understanding business processes. So I can tell you a couple. Right now, CMMC is created by and managed by the Department of Defense, and it actually is underway, and I am working through getting that certification. But it looks at all of the same types of controls that you find in NIST 800. NIST also publishes the cybersecurity framework. While that's not a maturity model, it is very much a model for running your cybersecurity. But NIST also has a cybersecurity framework that touches on functions, categories, subcategories, and informative references like standards and guidelines and practices. And it has the repeatable process: identify, protect, detect, respond, recover. But back to CMMC, now any kind of contractor or subcontractors in that whole chain has to be CMMC cybersecurity maturity model certified. And what they do differently, they don't have controls. What they have is practices. A control says you need to do something, but a practice leads you down more of a path of maturity. So you could use that maturity model. That maturity model would start from it's not existent at all to it's more advanced. There's also a model published by the SANS Institute, and it has, they basically all have 5 levels from non-existent to an advanced category. But you can't forget, once you hit that advanced category, if you do, because that is hard to attain, you may not stay there for long. You may not be there tomorrow. It all depends on that landscape that keeps changing in front of us. So I'm not sure, did I answer the question?
I'm going to assume yes, but I'll jump in here too and say there's actually a specific maturity model that's been out there for probably 5 or 6 years now, specific just to vulnerability management, which also follows kind of that level 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, where the way most people do it right now is kind of the level 1. I'm just going to use that CVSS score and just, you know, tackle them like that all the way through level 5, where you're doing that, identifying critical assets, prioritizing based on the criticality of the asset, and then even using other inputs to the process, you know, identifying threat vectors and using some of that new intelligence that's out there, and maybe input from other tools you might have in your environment. We didn't really talk about that in the briefing, but vulnerability management is just one piece of the CDM space that the federal government uses, but you know, it applies to everyone, that continuous diagnostics and mitigation. So it's integrating all of those other pieces you have out there to inform your risk management program, not just your vulnerability management, but, you know, asset management and all those other cool tools you might have out there, managing things on your network.
And the SANS, just to add on, the SANS maturity model, it starts from non-existent and then more of an ad hoc scanning, but it goes all the way up into business risk management at its highest level. Okay, is there any other questions? All right.
Well, I was going to say, I don't see any more specifically in here, but I can tell you one question I get asked a lot,
Okay.
not just by our customers, but by management when we get a new project is how long is this going to take and when should I get started? And
Oh, on your assessment, you mean?
yeah. Well, I mean, just for all of this, but for an assessment for sure, especially a compliance, how far in advance do you need to get started? The answer is as soon as you can, because very infrequently are you on point the first time you start. It's that whole scope thing, right? You need to account for that change in scope as part of the process. So the sooner you can start, the better is really the short answer. Don't wait until the last minute. Certainly don't wait until, a month or two before your compliance report or whatever it is you have to do is due, because there's always going to be something that, even in a perfect world where someone even has a robust and mature, the customer you're working with, their program's mature, you still might find something they've missed.
And I think that, just to add on, I think that's why sometimes compliance isn't always secure, because it's taken sometimes as, when I have to report my compliance, that's when I worry about it, or a couple months in front of that. And you need to be secure. You need to be doing the same thing all year round, not just
Right.
when it's time to do
Right.
your report.
I see some more feedback in the chat is the best answer is to tell a customer you should always be started. And I kind of think of that as it's not a sprint, it's a marathon, right? You're not suddenly running to get to the goal. You're just kind of, maybe not a marathon, like a nice jog, right? You're just it's continuous. You're continuously monitoring. And then I see another question. I think this one might be for Sam. Is there a way in your vulnerability scanning tool to actually identify critical assets and prioritize risk? Like how would you use that for compliance?
Oh, that's a great question. Yes, there are a number of different features in SAINT which can help you identify critical assets and prioritize risk. So one of those features is asset tagging, and that allows you to tag your assets. You can tag them based on any criteria you want, but one of the good ways to tag your assets is by the asset's business value, so that you can maybe tag an asset as being critical or high, medium, or low as far as their value to the organization. And once you have your assets tagged, that can help you prioritize your remediation by, for example, filtering your report so you only see the critical assets first. And then once that's remediated, you might want to add the high assets and then the medium and low. Another great feature we have is custom severity levels. So the CVSS rating is great, but that might not reflect the true impact of a vulnerability in your environment. And so you can create custom severity levels in order to create your own vulnerability impact metric specific to your environment that can help you prioritize the risk.
I actually see that as a great benefit, because using my example, this vulnerability in my environment may be not risky, but in another one it might be. So denial of service is often a common problem with certain vulnerabilities. Well, if availability is really important in your environment, those vulnerabilities might need to be changed to have a much higher risk rating than if availability really isn't all that important in your environment. And if somebody wants to, denial of service attack you, that you don't really care. And then with the asset tagging, lots of organizations also have asset management tools. And if you can kind of marry the two together and use similar tagging, then you can also use the tool to quickly say, I need a list of all of the, this type of host in this location running this piece of software, not just by using the normal vulnerabilities the scanner finds, but just the tags that you've assigned to the assets without actually having to look at the vulnerabilities or enumerated software. You can just, once you've done that first kind of discovery scan, then you can add these tags. And that's a great way to really slice and dice your results quickly once you've identified tags you want to assign to those assets.
Quinn, do you see any other questions?
I don't. I think that might be it.
All right. Well, just to summarize everything, from the business perspective, we talked about the most important element that allows you to boost your security being joining both your risk management and your vulnerability management together. And then the pitfall is when you do not communicate to the executive level and you don't develop a plan for cybersecurity to improve over time and evolve. And that boost that we talked about for merging these two together and layering in that maturity over top of those two programs. Also, formally defining policies and procedures that explain exactly how to make it continuous and repeatable, and then training the people to make sure they know the policies and procedures. And you also want to verify that they understood. I mean, I used to walk through the hallways for a HIPAA assessment and say, when was the last time you took HIPAA training? And they said, oh, I had HIPAA training at my last job. And it was like, you haven't had HIPAA training when you started here? And they hadn't. So there's a way to measure and see if people know where the policies and procedures are and if they're implemented. Sam, can you wrap up a little bit?
Sure. So from a technology perspective, I think the most important takeaway here is that you want to invest your effort in securing your environment rather than just achieving a passing score. And in doing this, the proper use of a vulnerability management tool is key, preferably a management tool that has the features you need, such as software inventory and discovery scanning. Clear trend reporting is important in order to find the differences due to things like new vulnerabilities, new systems being brought online, changing CVSS scores, and temporal factors. And also in your tool, integration with cloud environments is helpful for tracking your cloud assets as you scale up. And as I said earlier, discovery scans and passive scans can help you detect shadow IT systems.
Jane, do you have a wrap up for us?
Yep, I do. It kind of summarizes everything else everybody else has said, is that maturity is the key. Your risk and management and vulnerability management programs need to include everything. You know, that you need to make sure that you're assessing and scanning continuously. It's not a one and done. And then you need to identify those critical assets, and that communications is part of that. Everybody needs to be on the same page, speak the same language, and included in the conversation. And that metrics, that time-based metrics are a better measure of progress.
Awesome. Well, we have contact information up on the screen if you want to get a hold of us, or if you think of more questions, send them in. And we just want to thank you and invite you to enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.